The temple. I was thinking of Brother Jeff when I was studying these notes today. Anybody that works with wood, I don't work with wood that often, but one of the things I remember being told for as long as I can remember, if you measure twice, you'll cut once. If you measure once, you're more than likely to cut twice. So when God says he's going to measure something, there's two reasons that we in our human minds can conclude that he's going to do, or the reason he's going to measure. And to kind of simplify it, one of the reasons would be to measure to make sure something's complete. A second reason maybe to make sure that it fits or it's the right size. But there's two applications here in the scripture, and one of them is spiritual and the other is physical. And they both apply to us. When God measures us, we need to be reminded in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and I think it's verses 16 and 17. He says, "Know ye not that you are the temple of God?" You're saved tonight, and I think everybody else is by testimony saved, then your body is a temple of God. If you go on and read that verse, and I'll read it to you, it says, "Know ye not that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? If any man defile the temple of God," this ought to make us tremble. "If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy." Now there's, again, a couple of ways we can interpret that. Number one, it could be a broad defilement, like somebody else defiling your temple. Somebody defiles your temple. This is, another scripture says, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." When somebody hurts us, harms us, or hurts somebody that belongs to us. And I can remember, it hadn't been that long ago, Pat and I were in an Aldi somewhere, I don't remember where, and she had to go to the restroom, as did I, and I started heading out, and there was a man come out of the ladies' room. And I turned around and looked at her, and she says, "What's the matter?" And I said, "There's a man just come out of the ladies' room." I want to make sure everybody in that store knew that. You mess with what I consider to be mine, you're going to have to deal with me. And that's what God is saying. You mess with what is his, you're going to have to deal with him. So he is saying, if any man defile the temple of God, of course, we can defile it ourselves. But God will not kill us unless we reject him. Now, I had to think about this for a minute. If we reject him, then this is not a temple of God. Does that make sense? So this is more talking about somebody defiling your temple. If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy, for the temple of God is holy, which temple ye are. Talking about that's not a question, it's a statement. You're saved, so you are God's temple. But having said that, we need to be mindful that we too have a responsibility to take care of this temple. I cannot tell you how many people that I have met over time and look at them and meet them and talk with them, and after talking with them for a while, I have to stop and say, "How old are you?" And they'll say, "I'm 35. And they look like they're in their 60s because they haven't taken care of this temple. And particularly, I don't want to get too far off a track here, but there's a lot of diseases out there that could be conquered if people would stop doing the things that cause the disease. We had a couple in our church, and they were they were very faithful, and he especially was kind of like a handyman, was always working around the church, and they always sat about midway down as we'd go down the middle aisle, and he'd be on the right, and I'd shake his hand and her hand. And every time I shook her hand, I'd go away and had this cigarette smoke on my hand, because she was a very, he told me one time she smoked about 10 packs a day. And then she got lung cancer. And the doctor cut out a bunch of her lungs and everything else, and told her, said, if you keep smoking, you're going to die. Well, guess what? She kept smoking. So she died. Now, sometimes, you know, we apply that application in that circumstance, and perhaps it applies that way, because if you know what to do and you don't do it, then God will deal with it. He'll take that person to heaven. So there's two applications here, both the spiritual and the physical. Look at verses 1 and 2. And there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein. But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not. For it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months. This appears to be the same angel that we met back in chapter 10, and at least twice before in the Old Testament, first in Ezekiel in chapter 40 and Zechariah in chapter 2. God requires elements to be measured. So this is not the first time we read about God requiring something to be measured. So we just need to remember that when God's measuring here, he's measuring to make sure it's complete. And when it comes to us, when he measures us, he wants to make sure we're complete. He wants to make sure that we're complete. In 2 Corinthians 6:16, it says, Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord. As Christians, God doesn't want us to live within sin. I can remember when I got saved, I was 13, that summer I came back, and then I went away to a camp, military type camp, Boy Scout. I think the Boy Scouts sponsored it, but it was kind of like they were trying to teach us survival skills, and we were like 13, 14 years old, and took us out there, and we were at Tyndall Air Force Base, and it was right on the Gulf, and there was some islands out there, not too far out there, maybe not quite a mile. You could see each of them. If you were on the island, you could see the coastline of Florida. If you were in Florida, you could see the island out there. But they took a bunch of us out there and basically dropped us off and said, we'll be back in 24 hours. Enjoy. Now, they had led us up to that. They had taught us some skills of what to do. And they had taught us that when the tide come in, it would cover that little island out there. And it wasn't very long. The island's probably maybe not much bigger than this auditorium here. So the first thing I did when I hit there, I started figuring out what tree I could climb, because I was going to get up in a tree, because if there's going to be water down there and they didn't tell us how deep it was going to be, I was going to get as far away from it as I could. And then the next thing I did is they had, they didn't have any coconuts out there, but they had given us some maps, and they had buried some survival stuff like MREs, meals ready to eat is what that stands for, and trust me, if there's anything else to eat, you'll eat it. So several of us we knew it was going to go out there, so we had taken some monofilament fishing line with us and some hooks and so forth and things like that. So we were going to do some fishing, and we did. And a couple of us caught fish. And but then we realized we hadn't been smart enough to bring stuff to start a fire, so we couldn't cook the fish. And I told them even then, I don't like sushi. I ain't eating that raw stuff. But I said all of that to say that when God measures us, he measures to see if we're complete. And I hadn't been saved very long, but I'm sitting there with about 4 or 5 guys with me, and it was every other word was a 4-letter word. I mean, it was like every guy was trying to show how manly he was, and they couldn't do that unless he used it, with all these expletives. And I was trying very hard to, control my mouth. And I remember thinking that when I left there, I was talking to another Christian friend about it, and he said, well, that's God working in your heart. So I said, well, we need to go to church. So we went to church, and it was a chapel, and that was the worst thing I could have probably done. Because the chapel was a social club in those days. Probably still is. But I do remember that following being saved, that there was a working going on inside me. That God was saying, I don't want you to do that no more. I don't want you to hang out with those anymore. And when we see this, the rest of this verse in 2 Corinthians 6:17, it says, wherefore come out from among them and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you. There's Christians today that say, well, that doesn't apply to us today because we don't have to worry about unclean things. There's a whole lot of unclean things out there. Drugs are unclean. A second suggestion of this verse could be that God is surveying his property to reclaim it. Remember back in chapter 10, we read about the little book, which I said was a deed to the earth, that Christ is going to reclaim this earth. The phrase, them that worship therein, could be referring to the 144,000, because remember, during the tribulation period, there will not be the freedom to worship as we have right here. There's no scriptural evidence to say that a person cannot be saved during the tribulation period, but there is scriptural evidence to say that you cannot openly worship God. But these 144,000 have been sealed by God, remember, and so they can't hurt them. They can't hurt them. They can worship God. The temple referred to here is not in existence today. In fact, the entire city of Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed in 70 AD by Titus. And only part of the temple remains today that is called the Western Wall. And the old city of Jerusalem has been rebuilt. And remember, God sent Nehemiah to rebuild the wall around the city that they had rebuilt. Going back and looking at Ezra, we see several groups were released to go back to rebuild Jerusalem. They did that, but they never rebuilt the temple. And reason why, and they didn't rebuild the temple. And then in about 6 or 7, probably about 800 AD, after Christ's death, the Muslims came in and they built a Muslim mosque on the site. There's a rock altar there, and that rock altar is believed to be where Abraham would have offered Isaac as a sacrifice. And so the temple was built around it, and this rock altar was in the courtyard. The Muslims, however, believe that that same rock is where Muhammad went up to heaven. It's interesting, they believe that he ascended up into heaven, but yet he's got a grave site over there with a dead body in it. But that's another message. But when we look at this, we read Revelation that there's a temple. There's a temple that God refers to. There's two temples, actually. One is in heaven and one is in Jerusalem. There is no temple in Jerusalem today. There's no temple there. So that temple has to be rebuilt. For the last 50 some odd years, I have been reading about what we would call the Orthodox Jews, or the Orthodox Israelis. They have been stockpiling materials to both build the temple as well as to furnish the temple biblically according to the way the Bible describes it. So all that would need to happen is for that Dome of the Rock to be removed, and it's not going to be removed in any kind of political climate that I've lived in, nor is it going to be removed in this political climate. But in the last several years, Hamas has been firing rockets indiscriminately into Israel. And every year they seem to get a little bit more distance to them. Every year they seem to be able to go further. And it's only a matter of time, potentially, that they're going to be destroying property that belonged to the Muslims. There's a potential that it could destroy this Dome of the Rock. That's just one particular scenario that could take place to clear it out to where that the temple could be rebuilt. Personally, I don't think the temple is going to be rebuilt until during the tribulation period. I don't think it'll be built here, but I've read other scholars that say, well, we'll see the beginning of it. Well, we're already seeing the beginning of it, and that is them stockpiling materials to build it and furnishings to go into it, facsimiles mostly, where they cannot find the original thing. For example, the Ark of the Covenant, they don't have it. It's up in the temple up in heaven. But they have built a facsimile. So we continue to consider this. We're doing in the church age, and we're not likely to see anything like that. And I've heard or read where scholars have pointed out that this Dome of the Rock is built over this rock altar that Abraham offered Isaac on, and it was actually in the courtyard of the temple. And God, if we back up, and we'll go back and read that again, he says, and there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein, but the court that is without the temple leave out. Don't measure it. So if you don't measure it, if you just built the temple building and didn't build the courtyard around it, you wouldn't have to move the Dome of the Rock. So that's one possibility. However, for a period, about half of this 3.5 years that we'll talk about it in a moment, about this false peace that the Antichrist is going to bring and allow the temple to even be there. He's going to also to allow them to offer sacrifices within the temple. There is nothing that I have ever read. There is no Jew that I have ever talked to. And one of the reasons why they do not offer sacrifices today, because they do not have the temple to offer sacrifices, and their understanding, their Torah tells them, you do not offer sacrifices anywhere except the temple. So if the temple ain't there in the courtyard, and they're not going to do blood sacrifices inside the temple, that would be something to do out in the courtyard. So my point is that particular scenario probably wouldn't happen, because there would be no place for them to offer sacrifices. In Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, we read, let me read it to you. It says, And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, that's 7 years, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Oblation is an offering, a sacrifice. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even unto the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. The covenant is this peace treaty that the Antichrist will make. And it says, for 1 week or 7 years through here, and we go back and study Daniel chapter 9 in its entire context, we'll see that the 70 weeks means 490 years, and for 483 years the Israelites were in captivity, and there's different terminology being used as to what has happened now, but there's been a pause. God has paused and said, okay, for 483 years you have not listened to me. And I'm paraphrasing. God is telling the Jewish people, you have not listened to me. I brought you the Messiah. I gave you the Messiah. He died on the cross for your sins. I removed or expired the need to offer blood sacrifices, because Christ died and paid that price on the cross, but yet you still haven't listened to me. So for the moment, my focus is going to be with the Gentile. And you just keep doing what you're doing. Now, that's just all paraphrasing. So the 7 years to round out that 490 years is going to be the tribulation period. So much of the tribulation period, God's going to be dealing with Israel. I read somebody comment here recently that said that Jews are out of here. They're out of it. They're not having anything to do with it. And y'all need to pray for me, because sometimes I want to get in the midst of stuff like that and just really cut loose. And if I do that, then the next thing I know, I'm going to be teaching online, and I ain't got time to do that. But we need to stand firm with this book right here. And it goes on. The only place, as I said, a God-fearing Jew, if I can say that again, is going to offer sacrifices in the temple in Jerusalem. We should also remember in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4, I've written down there, it says, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. That's that's Paul talking to the church of Thessalonica and saying, this is what's going to take place. Again, talking about the tribulation period. This guy's going to show up and he's going to raise himself up to be God. He's going to sit in the house of God, but he's not God. In chapter 9, and Daniel, in verse 2, and I'll wrap it up here with 2 chapters here, some other prophecy to fulfill what we're talking about here. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of years. This is talking about the week, meaning 7 years, whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years, that's 490 years, in the desolations of Jerusalem. Then in chapter 11, 2 chapters down, in verse 31, he says, and arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. So what we see here is that the Antichrist is going to give the Jews, he's going to sign a peace treaty with them. And then in the middle of that peace treaty, he says, oh, I was just kidding. We're not going to do that anymore. And this is my place because I'm God. He's going to take over. Excuse me. He's going to take over the temple. And Christ refers to this in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15. It says, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, what is it? That's when the Antichrist takes over the temple. What do you think, goodness, how we would view it if the city walked through the doors right now and said that there's something that happened way back when and the records were wrong, and it doesn't matter how much you paid for that building, and it doesn't matter that you paid off with the mortgage and all of this and that. This belongs to the city. You guys get out of here. We're going to turn this into a strip club. What would you call this? Would you call it a desolation of God's house? Well, that's what the Antichrist is going to do to the temple. And God goes on, he says then in John chapter 4, verse 43, in the words of Christ, he says, I am come in my Father's name, and you receive me not. If another shall come in his own name, him you will receive. Now Christ is talking to the Jews, basically. He's basically saying, you wouldn't receive me, but you're going to receive this idiot that's going to come in and take over the temple. He's given prophecy here. The abomination is the fact that the Antichrist will take over the temple. The desolation occurs when he sets himself up as God. That's when God removes everything, every kind of protection from that temple, every kind of protection from the weather, every kind of protection from earthquakes, everything. That guy's on his own. He thinks he's a hot shot. But when God turns loose of everything that he's holding back, is what we're going to see here in the final 11 plus chapters of Revelation. I'll read verse 3 and then we'll stop there. And I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. I'll give you some homework. Find out who the 2 witnesses are going to be. Okay? Why? Okay? That's true. That is what everybody says. But wherever God asks it, Lord, show me. Show me how I can know it's Moses and Elijah. And there's evidence there. But let me give you one thing to think about. As we understand it, can these human bodies, without God intervening, die and then come back to life? Okay? Can't happen. The witnesses will die physically. Now, if an angel comes, Antichrist can't kill an angel. But yet these witnesses will come. So if you go back and study all the scholars and this and that and so forth, these are human beings that God put here on earth, two witnesses, gave them a job to do, and when the Antichrist comes, he murders them. He murders them. Then for 3.5 years, they witness, they do God's direction, and they leave them dead, laying wherever it is they murder them for 3.5 days. And the whole world sees them. Now, I make that as a point because the first time I heard the book of Revelation, our pastor pointed out the fact that while he thought the rapture could occur any moment, right now we do not have the technology for the whole world, and this is in 1971, we do not have the technology for the whole world to see it visibly at the same time. 10 years down the road, we were in Germany. We had a lot of satellites in those days. 10 years, it was amazing how satellite technology had expanded. And I remember getting up, I had to take a flight somewhere, I don't remember where, and I was up in about the middle of the night, and I flipped on the TV, and it was the day that President Reagan, back here in the States, they attempted an assassination on his life, and it was live on TV in Munich, Germany, as long as you got up in the middle of the night to watch it. So we had the capability then, and we do now, that we can see something like that around the world all at the same time. So what I'm saying is that God keeps lining things up. Keeps lining things up to where we get more and more understanding of what he's going to do and how he's going to do it. Father, we love you so much.